Paris, specifically in the 1990s, it wasn't only the Champs-Élysées lights that captured attention. There was something else hiding in the shadows, something that made blood run cold. Imagine with me, dear listener, walking through one of Paris's ancient neighborhoods, where classical architecture meets the aroma of coffee and fresh pastries. Suddenly, the silence of the night is shattered by the howl of a police siren, and yellow tape bursts onto the scene, bearing an unmistakable word: crime scene. This wasn't just any crime. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would later be known as the case of the invisible shadow serial killer, or as the press dubbed him at the time, the Beast of Bastille. Our story begins in a small apartment in the historic Montmartre district, where an elderly woman named Madame Rousseau lived. Madame Rousseau, 68 years old, led a very quiet life. Her daily routine never changed: a croissant from the neighborhood bakery, the morning paper, and sitting on her balcony, watching artists paint their canvases in the square below. She had no fortune, and she had no enemies. She was simply a kind woman who loved flowers and her white cat. But fate had a tragic end in store for her, an end that would become the first thread in a tapestry of terror. On a cold morning, the neighbors noticed something strange. Madame Rousseau's white cat was sitting at her apartment door, letting out sad, continuous meows. At first, no one paid much attention. Perhaps she had gone out and was running late, but hours passed, day turned to night, and the cat remained there, whimpering like a lost child. Concern began creeping into the residents' hearts, especially Monsieur Jacques, the bakery owner on the ground floor, who was accustomed to seeing her every morning. A strange feeling of fear crept into him, a sense that something horrifying had happened. They called the police, and 2 ordinary officers arrived, assuming it was nothing more than a fall or a health episode for an elderly woman. When they forced the door open, the smell was the first thing that greeted them. It wasn't just the smell of death, but the smell of something else, a scent of indescribable violence. With cautious steps, they entered the apartment to find a scene that would remain etched in their memories forever. Madame Rousseau was seated in her favorite chair, but she wasn't looking out the window. Her hands were tied with clothesline behind her back, and her mouth was stuffed with torn pieces of her own clothing. But the most horrifying moment, the thing that made one officer stagger backward, was that her eyelids had been sewn shut with thick sewing needles, forcing her eyes to remain open forever, staring into the void. The scene was gruesomely theatrical. There were no signs of forced entry, no chaos. The killer entered and left like a ghost. All they found, besides the body, was a small piece of paper the size of a palm, pinned to her chest with a pin, on which was written in elegant, beautiful handwriting a single phrase: the first dance. The investigators didn't understand the meaning of the phrase at first. They thought it was just the scribble of a madman. But they didn't know that this paper was nothing less than an announcement of the beginning of a symphony of horror yet to be completed, and that the next dance was about to begin. Just 2 weeks later, in an entirely different neighborhood, in the 11th arrondissement, where the working class lived, the widow, Lucienne, was preparing for bed. Lucienne was 75, a strong woman who had lived a hard life after her husband's death in a factory accident, and she lived completely alone. That night, while sipping her chamomile tea, she heard a soft knock on her door. "Who is it?" she asked in her trembling voice. A gentle reply came, the voice of a calm and polite man. "I'm your new neighbor from the floor above. Sorry to bother you, but I forgot my keys and I need to use your phone to call an ambulance. My wife is very ill." The man's tone was pleading, with a softness that melted Lucienne's heart. She opened the door trustingly, to face a kind face, wearing an elegant coat and holding a bouquet of flowers in his hand. "These are for you. A small apology," the man said with a smile. In that moment, Lucienne didn't see the flowers. She saw only darkness. The man pounced on her with the force of a beast, and the horrific scene repeated itself once more. A body tied to a chair, eyes sewn shut with needles, and the same small piece of paper. But this time, written on it, "The second dance." This time, all of Paris went mad. These were no longer just murders. They had become a signature, a fingerprint of a killer who didn't just want to kill, but wanted to humiliate his victims, to control them in their final moments, to force their eyes to see his face as he took their lives. Terror spread through the city. Elderly women who used to go out for walks or to buy bread locked themselves inside. Loneliness transformed from a mere feeling of sadness into real terror, a fear of being alone, because being alone now meant being easy prey. Detective Pierre Cordier, a middle-aged man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too much of this world's ugliness, was summoned to take over the case. Cordier was an old-school detective who believed that behind every crime there was a reason, even if it was madness. He stood in the first victim's apartment, surveying the scene, breathing in the air as if trying to smell the killer's scent. "The dances," he said softly, looking at the paper. "Why does he call them dances?" His team began gathering the threads. The similarities between the two victims were as clear as day. Elderly women living alone in modest neighborhoods with no money or valuable possessions. The motive then wasn't robbery. The motive was something deeper, something darker. The investigation led them to two crucial findings. The first was a faint, fresh scent, a smell of mint mixed with expensive men's cologne, found on the clothing of both victims. The second, and more important, was the analysis of the fabric remnants used to gag the victims' mouths. The fabric was of a very special type, usually used for cleaning violins, a soft cloth that leaves no scratches on the delicate wood. The violin, the scent of mint and luxurious cologne. Their killer wasn't just a thief or a thug. Their killer might be someone cultured, someone from an entirely different social class than his victims, someone who played music and wore the finest fragrances. "We're not looking for a beast from the gutter," Cordier told his team, gathered in the operations room, filled with cigarette smoke and photos of the bodies. "We're looking for a gentleman, perhaps handsome, with presence. A man an elderly woman would trust and open her door to in the middle of the night." This was the piece of information that turned the investigation upside down and leads us to the thrilling second half of our story. After the police issued a veiled warning, without causing panic, urging caution around strangers, no matter how kind they appeared, Detective Cordier began a meticulous search into the world of music. His team examined lists of students and graduates of music conservatories and tracked shops selling and repairing fine violins, looking for anyone with a history of violence or psychological disorders. The process was like searching for a needle in a haystack. until the information came from the most unexpected of places, within the walls of one of the most prestigious mental hospitals in the suburbs of Paris. An elderly nurse on the verge of retirement remembered a former patient who had terrified her 2 decades earlier. He was an exceptionally handsome young man from a decadent aristocratic family named Lucien Tessier. Lucien was a gifted violinist, but he was pathologically obsessed with his mother. His mother, who had been a famous ballet dancer in her youth, treated him with extreme cruelty. She would lock him in a dark closet for hours whenever he failed to play a musical piece perfectly. She would make him dance with her in the grand salon of their large home, long waltzes, and every time he made a misstep, she would dig her long fingernails into his shoulders while he was still a small child. This boy grew up, and his obsession with his mother turned into blind hatred, a hatred mixed with a severe mental disorder, making him see the image of his mother in every lonely old woman. He killed them with the same ritual, tying them to a chair to make them helpless just as he had been, and sewing their eyes with needles, forcing them to watch him, just as his mother had forced him to look at her while she punished him. Cordier asked, "Where is he now?" The answer was shocking. He was released 3 years ago. The doctors said his condition had improved and that he no longer posed a danger to society. Improved? The man standing before them now, the one they knew as Lucien Tessier, may have returned to the darkness from which he came, but this time to turn it into a gruesome reality on the streets of Paris. They now had a name and a face, a handsome face with piercing eyes, of a man who knew how to hide his brutality behind a mask of elegance and courtesy. The frantic search began. Every police force in Paris was looking for a ghost. They searched his apartment, which he had recently abandoned, finding what resembled a horrific temple. Walls covered with newspaper clippings about the victims, and in the center, a small platform holding a music stand. But instead of sheet music, there were childish, terrifying drawings of women with sewn eyes, and in the margins, the word mother was written hundreds of times. They also found the bottle of expensive cologne, that mixture of mint and musk, and beside it, a box of sewing needles, meticulously arranged. But more important than all of this was what they found carefully hidden beneath a loose wooden floorboard. It was a small ledger, like a diary, in which he recorded his victims. 3 women, with their names and dates, but next to each name, he wrote a description of their final dance. The writing was terrifying in its details, describing their muffled screams, their terrified eyes, as if he were writing a musical critique of his satanic performances. But the real horror was that the list wasn't finished. After the 3 victims, there was a 4th name and a final line written in large, different handwriting. The Last Dance, Symphony of Fire. Cordier felt an electric current shoot down his spine. The killer was no longer satisfied with individual murders. Symphony of Fire suggested something far bigger, something final and terrifying, perhaps a burning, an explosion, or a massacre involving a greater number of souls. They had no time. They had to stop him before the final piece began. And here, dear listener, the drama intensifies. Tracing his last phone calls from a public telephone led them to an old abandoned building, not a residence this time, but an old ballet theater in the 9th arrondissement, a theater famous in the 1940s that had closed after a small fire. It was the place that had witnessed his mother's brilliance and his humiliation. The place was locked, but from the outside, in the silence of the night, the police officers could hear the sound of a sorrowful violin, playing a melancholic melody that could make stones weep. They knew he was there, inside, preparing for his final act. The special unit stormed the dark building, floodlights cutting through the darkness and decades of accumulated dust. The smell was different this time, a sharp and strong smell, the smell of gasoline. Lucien had filled the entire abandoned theater with fuel cans, arranged in a circle around the ancient wooden stage. And in the middle of the stage, an elderly woman was tied to a wheelchair. This time, not silent, but weeping and sobbing in silent terror. He had just abducted her from a nearby nursing home to be the star of his final dance, to be his mother one last time. He stood at the edge of the stage, his violin under his chin in one hand, and in the other, he held an old silver lighter, his mother's only keepsake that he had kept. His eyes gleamed with the sparkle of madness mixed with the pleasure of victory. He looked at Detective Cordier, who advanced slowly and alone, ordering his men to stop, and smiled a cold smile. "Have you come to witness the final performance, Detective? I've waited for this moment for a long time," he said in a theatrical tone, looking at the poor old woman who was screaming, "Save me!" In that critical moment, tension had reached its peak. Any wrong move from the snipers positioned on the theater's upper balconies would mean the immediate death of the hostage. Lucien was moving the lighter in his hand like an orchestra conductor holding his baton. Cordier began speaking to him, not as a detective, but as a human being. He spoke to him about pain, about a stolen childhood, about that dark closet. "Lucien, your mother wasn't worth your tears. But these old women, they committed no sin. You didn't kill them. You killed your mother over and over again. But she still lives inside you. She's the one controlling you now, just as she did when you were a child." Cordier could see the struggle in the killer's eyes, between anger and pain, between the desire for revenge and the desire for salvation. Lucien's eyes filled with tears, and the hand holding the lighter began to tremble. He was living a moment of complete collapse as he began to hear, for the first time in years, the voice of his conscience, not the voice of his mother. Then, in a moment of human weakness, as he raised the violin high to strike the woman, reclaiming the memory of his mother beating him, the specialized unit seized the moment. A single bullet from a skilled sniper's rifle pierced his right hand, knocking the lighter from his grasp before it could touch the pool of gasoline. Lucien collapsed to his knees, not from pain, but from the collapse of his entire inner world. The police officers rushed forward. The hostage, who had been seconds away from burning to death, was rescued, and the monster who had terrorized Paris was restrained. In the end, Lucien Tessier was committed to a maximum security mental hospital, not as an ordinary criminal, but as a patient living in an endless hell. And in his white cell, the only thing left to him was a photo of his mother. He spoke to it every night in a soft voice, telling her that he had finally learned to dance to her tune. As for Paris, life returned to the city, and it breathed a sigh of relief. But the memory of those 4 dances remained engraved in memory as one of the most gruesome stories, proving that some monsters don't come from the unknown, but are born and made within the walls of homes, hiding behind the gentlest smiles and the most beautiful melodies. And so, dear listener, we conclude our story for this evening. A story that always reminds us that evil doesn't need fangs and claws. Sometimes, all it needs is a broken childhood and a mask of elegance. Good night, and until we meet in a new story.